The purpose of this video is to provide a crash course on caring for neurodivergent children. And in particular, I'll be going through a lot of specific examples or case studies of different situations that might come up when you're caring for neurodivergent children and potential ways that you could approach each situation. So just as an outline, I'll start by discussing different neurodivergent traits and giving examples of how each neurodivergent trait might show up in a childcare setting. So for example, how you might adapt the way that you care for a child with sensory processing differences to best meet their sensory needs and to create a comfortable environment for them. I'll also discuss different communication styles. I know that oftentimes childcare settings can really focus on spoken communication as the main or only method of communication, especially for older children. But there's a lot of other types of communication that can be used as well. The third area is emotional regulation. So if a child is starting to experience stress or overwhelm or anxiety, ways that we can help them de-escalate and generally help with soothing techniques for the child. And also if a child does have a meltdown, how to support them during a meltdown and keep everyone safe. Um, and finally, I'll briefly go through PDA, which is sometimes called pathological demand avoidance, but I think a less judgmental name for it is pervasive desire for autonomy, and ways that strategies that might potentially be beneficial when working with children who have a PDA profile of autism. So the first trait that I want to go through is sensory processing differences. Um, Many, if not the majority of neurodivergent children will have sensory processing differences of some type. So the main types of sensory input where this can appear could be light, sometimes really bright overhead lights, or just generally really bright environments can be overwhelming. On the other hand, a child who is sensory seeking, or who maybe has lower sensitivity to light might really seek out bright lights or be enchanted by very visually busy displays in general. Sound can also, of course, be a primary type of sensory input. And so a lot of background noise or sudden unexpected noises like sirens or noises from nearby roads can be distressing for children sometimes. Um, Touch. So touch can encompass not only touch from others, but also things like the texture of the clothing that a child's wearing, or if you're outdoors, the sensitivity of the child to water or to rain. A child might really like splashing in a puddle, for example, but might be really sensitive to the feeling, like once the initial distraction and fun of splashing in the puddle is done, they might be really sensitive to that sort of lingering feeling of having potentially a wet shoe or a wet sock on their foot. Um, Smell. So sometimes, if possible, it can be beneficial to just wear neutral products when you're working with a child. So no really strongly scented perfumes or colognes. Um, Sometimes sprays or insect repellent can also be a stronger scent. So if you're going to be applying, for example, an insect repellent in front of a child, if they seem to be sensitive to it, maybe taking a break to apply it could be beneficial, or applying it before working with them. And the sense of someone's body in space can also be, or sense of movement can also be different oftentimes in people with sensory processing differences. Um, of course, stimming, so repetitive movements like rocking back and forth, flapping hands, fidgeting, playing repetitively with hair, really anything that's a repetitive movement can also be very soothing for people with sensory processing differences. It can help block out unpleasant sensory stimuli and replace it with something a lot more predictable and a lot more enjoyable for the individual. And so stimming can really be an indication that someone is helping to accommodate themselves in an environment. Um, so to start with, I guess, a somewhat straightforward example, you could imagine that a child is in a relatively crowded area and they're covering their ears with the noise and with the crowdedness. And they do appear to be more stressed during times where the play area is busier, noisier, more crowded, etc. So some suggestions, I guess, generally speaking, I think the approach to these scenarios often relies on a combination of trying to change the environment of the child. And also to the extent that the child is going to be in an environment which may not be totally ideal, to help them come up with coping strategies for that. So in this case, ways that we could change the environment is maybe to offer them the option of going to a quieter area, or if they seem really overwhelmed, then suggesting or guiding them to a quieter area where there's less noise. And another option is to maybe, if they really are enjoying the place that they're at, to find a way to create more of a natural barrier or boundary for them so that they can have a little bit of distance from the crowdedness and from the noise. So an example would be if you're in a sandbox, you could literally draw a line in the sand to indicate the child's personal space and maybe ask those around them to give the child a bit of extra space while they're playing. Or in a room, you could maybe line up some chairs beside them, and that can be something that helps them feel a little bit more protected or contained, and gives them that sense of space, could be beneficial. And you could also help them just find a way to cover their ears or to block out the noise. So certainly if they have headphones, that would be perfect for a time like this. Or you could even just directly cover their ears yourself if that's something that they want and that they're comfortable with, to provide an extra layer of noise insulation. Um, and another example, kind of on the other end of the sensory spectrum, is the sensory seeking behavior. And it's also worth noting that I think I may have oversimplified it a little bit previously. Um, Individuals aren't necessarily entirely sensory seeking or entirely sensory sensitive. Oftentimes, someone might be sensory seeking for certain types of sensory input and sensory sensitive for other types of sensory input. So in this case, a child is trying to put objects off the ground into their mouth and sometimes also trying to lick objects. So starting with environmental changes, one change would be to find an environment where there's just fewer objects that the child could put in their mouth, and maybe also where the objects present in the environment would be less hazardous. So, for example, if a child's sitting by a lot of small rocks and they're trying to put rocks in their mouth, that's not ideal. So moving them to, for example, a grassy area where it's more open, there's really no main objects sticking out, or maybe an area where there's just larger toys that are less of a choking hazard, could be beneficial in this case. Or just if they want to stay where they're at, maybe clearing it off so that there's nothing within their reach that they could put in their mouth that would be hazardous. You can provide the child with a chewable stim toy, for example. That would be another replacement for them. And you can also distract them with an activity or with other types of sensory input. It could often be that they're not necessarily um, specifically seeking the feeling of chewing something or that specific type of tactile input. It could be that they just want more sensory input in general, and or maybe they're a little bit bored. And so offering them something with a lot of movement, or maybe singing a song with them, something that offers more engagement and input, could provide what they need in a totally different way as well. I also just wanted to quickly note that eating is a sensory experience in a few different ways. With eating, there's the texture of the food, there's the temperature of the food, there's of course the actual taste of the food, and there can also be the smell of the food in many instances as well. And for some children who are very visually aware, even the appearance of the food can really impact their enjoyment of it or their ability to eat it. And so I think oftentimes children with sensory processing differences are characterized as being really difficult, as if they're being intentionally difficult or picky eaters or resistant to trying new foods. But it could be that the food is genuinely really distressing for them to eat or genuinely very overwhelming. I think for anyone, there's going to be some threshold where sensory input becomes overwhelming. Um, Even if you don't have any type of sensory sensitivity around food, there are probably some foods that to you taste really unpleasant or really rancid, and no matter how much you wanted to be polite, you just wouldn't be able to eat them. Or if you absolutely had to, it would be a really, really miserable experience. And I think that that's probably somewhat similar to the experience that people with sensory sensitivities have. when they're forced to eat a food that's really unpleasant for them. So I think really the main message here is just empathy and not assuming that someone's being intentionally difficult by not wanting to eat a certain food and respecting that choice. But more practically, sometimes foods that are a little bit safer or less likely to cause distress would be foods with a consistent texture and flavor. Um, or if a child seems to really enjoy strong flavors, sometimes things on the extremes can be helpful. So frozen things, things that do have really intense flavors, um, can be beneficial. A second sort of domain of neurodivergent traits include routine and predictability. So this is, of course, going to vary from person to person, but many autistic individuals and neurodivergent individuals more broadly can really thrive with routine and predictability. So this could include wanting to repeat the same play sequence over and over. A child might be very happy to play the exact same thing for hours straight and just take a lot of joy from that. There might also be that sort of routine with wanting to eat the same food, or in some cases, associating places with routines. So if a child has been to a place once before and the first time they were there, for example, once they entered, they did a specific task right away. They might want to repeat that the next time they're there because that's in their mind, that's part of their routine when they go to this place. And sudden changes from that can be stressful. I think something that's really correlated with routine is also the intense interest that many autistic individuals can have. And this could sometimes appear as ability to talk about that favorite interest for really long periods of time, or to be cheered up by that interest sometimes. I think autistic people can find a lot of comfort and joy in our interests, and that's one of the most pleasant parts of being autistic, in my opinion. Um, the flip side of, I think, this comfort and desire from routine is that if there's a lack of routine or if there's a sudden change or interruption, that can be quite distressing. And that can be especially true if the interruption happens during a routine. Um, because then not only is there an unexpected change, but it's also happening in the middle of something that usually provides a sense of predictability. So having extra support with transitions and being careful of when transitions occur can be really beneficial when providing childcare for neurodivergent children. So one example is, what if you're with a child and a child just wants to line up objects repeatedly? Maybe they are just stacking sticks side by side and doing that over and over for pretty much the entire time that you're caring for them. Um, our main suggestion is certainly for short-term childcare to really just uh, appreciate the way that the child's playing. Um, my personal perspective is that play is play, and that might sound a little bit overly simplistic, but anytime that we're expecting a child to play, to just explore on their own, to use their creativity, um, to relax, whatever they're enjoying, as long as it's safe, that is the way that they play. That doesn't mean that there's never going to be an opportunity for them to have something more structured or set aside times for education or other activities. But any time that's dedicated for play really shouldn't have additional requirements imposed on it beyond basic safety. I view it a little bit like people's musical preferences. There's people who enjoy music that deeply that I personally don't really take any satisfaction from. And I'm sure they probably feel the same about the music that I listen to as well. Um, but that doesn't mean that I should be training them to enjoy my type of music more. It's just a difference in how we approach things. And just like play preferences can be very different from child to child. And the reason I go on this tangent is because oftentimes autistic play is really perceived as non-functional, or having something wrong with it or needing correction. And so I think that's sort of why we try to really strongly emphasize the desire for children to play however they're naturally led to. Um, that also doesn't mean that volunteers can't take the opportunity to further support the child. So in this case, um, even if a child isn't directly seeking input from a volunteer, they might still enjoy the volunteer's presence. So it can be helpful to still sit really close to the child. I mean, sit nearby the child and maybe even see if they want you to engage in their play a little bit more. So you could hand them things to line up. You can provide encouragement, commentary, appreciate their dedication to lining things up, and maybe note how long the line is getting, or how cool it is to see them enjoying it that much. And of course, always to take cues from the child where if it seems like they don't want to be handed things, if they want to find it on their own as part of the play, not to push it. Other ways that we can add predictability is to only mention activities that you're relatively sure will actually be able to happen. And this can be tricky. It's not possible to predict everything. But for example, if you want to take a child to see their friend in a different part of the playground or play area, if you say, okay, we're going to go to the sandbox and see your friend, it's best to only mention that if you're really quite sure that their friend is going to be in the sandbox. Otherwise, you might take them to the sandbox and it will be suddenly different than what they expected, and they might have to then go to a different location to look for their friend. Um, so kind of just keeping that in mind as you're making suggestions. In some cases, using visual timers or visual schedules can be helpful. If those aren't on hand, there can sometimes be other ways of giving advance notice before transitions. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 5 minutes until we go somewhere else. It could be let's count down, or let's do this activity 2 more times or 3 more times, or however many times makes sense for that activity before transitioning. But some kind of countdown can be helpful, and it can make it less abrupt than just suddenly telling a child that they need to immediately move to a different spot. And in particular, whenever possible, it's helpful to avoid stopping or asking a child to transition between activities when they're partway through a routine. So if a child is, for example, singing the same song over and over, let them finish the song before having them move somewhere else, even if they do need to move away, unless, of course, it's an emergency. And understanding the child's routines over time can be helpful for identifying that and figuring out when might be a natural break point for them to switch activities versus when it might be a little bit more distressing. Um, as mentioned before, we did also want to briefly cover different types of communication. So this is not an exhaustive list at all, but some different types include augmentative and alternative communication. So this can include AAC devices. It can also include more low-tech AAC devices, like boards or sheets that children can point to indicate different things that they're communicating. In some examples, it could include a child pointing to different pictures representing different places in the play area. For example, a picture of the playground to show that they want to go there. Um, and we really try to avoid prioritizing spoken language over AAC. I think sometimes there can be an inclination to try and push or encourage a child to use spoken language, especially if they are able to sometimes use spoken language instead of AAC. But many children will benefit from having all communication options presented to them as equally useful and important types of communication. Gestures and nonverbal communication can certainly be really helpful. So just generally tracking what kind of gestures or noises or facial expressions a child makes when they're happy versus when they're sad. Sometimes the way that a child stims can be indicative of how they're feeling. It's pretty common for autistic individuals to, for example, flap hands when excited or happy, and maybe have a different type of stimming when feeling stressed. And so sometimes either trying to find that information by observing or getting that information from a caregiver beforehand can be really helpful for decoding how the child is feeling. Spoken language, of course, is a type of communication. I think that's one that's quite commonly recognized, and so I won't go into that quite as much. But one specific aspect of spoken communication that I did want to discuss is echolalia and gestalts. I'm not sure if I actually pronounced that correctly, but this can refer to sometimes children who might repeat back part of what you say to them. So, for example, if you ask them if something sounds good, they might repeat the end of the sentence, which says sounds good. And that may or may not mean that it actually does sound good to them. It could just mean that they're repeating back to you part of what you said, and that's part of their language learning process. And gestalts can also occur when children learn language through chunks. So Most neurotypical children learn by first memorizing individual words. So, for example, cat, ran, other simple words, and then stacking them together to create phrases, and then stacking the phrases together to eventually create sentences and full conversations. Um, and on the other hand, a lot of autistic children are Gestalt language learners, and so will have something of the reverse process. They might first memorize and start reciting um, larger chunks of language. So this could be phrases from books, phrases from favorite movies, and then over time, they'll learn how to sort of mix and match parts of those phrases. And then finally, we'll break down that mix and matching until they have individual words that they can combine. Um, and so the final destination is the same. Both analytic language learners and Gestalt language learners eventually are combining language to um, express thoughts in full conversations. But the initial starting point can be very different. Knowing that Gestalt language learning is a phenomenon can be really helpful for avoiding frustration on both the part of the child and the caregiver. For example, you can imagine a child keeps saying, let's take our coat off when they arrive at their favorite play area. But then if you offer to help them take off their coat, they don't seem to want that. And they also don't seem to be interested in taking off their coat at all. Um, this can sometimes be perceived as if the child's asking for something and then constantly refusing it. But from the child's perspective, they might not be saying anything literally about their coat at all. They might be repeating a phrase that has a special meaning to them. And so it's in this type of scenario, it's helpful to first understand that this is likely a gestalt. It likely doesn't mean that the child literally wants you to take off their coat. Um, if you have enough time with the child, you can try and identify patterns to decode the meaning. Do they tend to say this phrase when they're happy? Do they tend to say this phrase when they're in a new place? Um, what other common thread can you find between places that they're saying this phrase that can help you figure out approximately what the phrase seems to mean to them? And in some cases, it can be helpful to reference if it's available. Sometimes caregivers will provide a list of the most common phrases that a child uses, and the meaning of it. And so being able to reference that can be really helpful as well. So you don't have to guess or, have an observation period before being able to decode what the phrase means. Yeah, so another trait or another area is social communication differences. And this can include turn taking in conversations. Generally speaking, I think that neurotypical children and adults tend to have a little bit more of a rapid back and forth in interactions. So in conversations with small talk, you have, hi, how are you? I'm good. How are you? And the conversational ball is constantly being passed back and forth. And with play, we often see that where um, children are also doing fairly quick turn taking in their play with playing house with different types of sports where you're literally passing a ball back and forth, etc. Um, and that can be the case, of course, for some neurodivergent children as well. But often neurodivergent children may have longer turns in both conversation and in play, or might have a different relation to it altogether. Sometimes neurodivergent children will prefer to watch or observe others playing, or to have more of a structured interaction where the rules are set out a little bit beforehand, and they don't have to kind of guess when it's their time to jump in and take a turn. Um, in conversations that could also present as talking about someone's favorite interest for a longer period of time, or um, maybe just asking a lot of questions instead of talking about themselves a lot. So the expectation, I think, of turn taking can sometimes be a little bit limiting. Really, as long as everyone involved in the interaction feels happy and respected, I think that's the main expectation to keep track of. Likewise, directness and understanding of unwritten rules can be an area where there's very frequent misunderstandings. So it can be helpful as you're sharing information with children to keep track of whether the child appears to be more of a direct and blunt communicator, and if so, are you communicating to them in a direct way? Or is there any area where you're expecting them to read between the lines or guess what you mean? Eye contact and facial expressions can also be areas of general difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals. Sometimes eye contact can be really overwhelming for neurodivergent people. And so one thing that I'd like to point out is that someone not making eye contact doesn't mean that they're not engaged in an interaction. It could actually be that not making eye contact is their way of freeing up mental energy so that they can engage more and really participate in the interaction. And I think that kind of brings me to the broader point, which is that sometimes caregivers with good intentions will have these sort of goals or benchmarks that they're hoping to see a child achieve. Um, in some cases, it could be the idea that a babysitting session or a caregiving session was more successful if the child wasn't interacting back and forth with their peers for much of the time, or that if a child made eye contact more often than the child, that's kind of a success. It's a mini goal to celebrate. Um, and I'm definitely not saying that we shouldn't celebrate a child having a successful social interaction, but just to sort of broaden the idea of what a successful social interaction looks like. Because for some children, they might be constantly bombarded with expectations for them to socialize frequently, to have a lot of interpersonal interactions when maybe they really need a lot more alone time. And so for them, maybe the most successful thing they could do at a camp or at an event or in any kind of childcare setting is to spend time on their own and to recharge. One of the last areas I want to discuss is the addressing of potential safety concerns. There's a few general guiding questions, which is first, if there is a safety concern like wandering, throwing objects, um, someone having a meltdown or getting closer to another person's personal space, does it really need to be addressed? In some cases, it definitely would need to be addressed if, a child is, for example, throwing an object that could cause harm to others. There's other situations where, for example, if a child is just lightly kicking the leg of a table that's sturdy and that isn't likely to be damaged, or if a child is shredding a paper that is going to be going into the recycling bin anyways, where maybe it doesn't really need to be addressed urgently. I think sometimes what can lead up to meltdowns is if children feel like they are frequently corrected over things that didn't necessarily have to be corrected immediately. And so sometimes it can be best to save that energy for situations that are really urgent and do need safety, um, and do definitely need to be addressed. Which brings us to sort of the second question of there may be things that do need to be addressed, but do they need to be addressed right now? Sometimes they do. Sometimes it's an imminent safety concern. In other instances, there might be a little bit more of a little bit of a time buffer that you could use. And finally, can it be addressed by changing the environment? For example, if a child is having a meltdown because of an unpleasant sensory input, it's important to think about ways that we can change that sensory input instead of just expecting the child to learn ways to cope with it constantly. So going through some of these, so what does it mean to change the environment? If we look at that in more detail, one of the first parts of this is figuring out signs that we need to change the environment in the first place. And it can be really helpful to look proactively for signs that stress is building, because the more that someone gets to be overwhelmed, while we can still always do things to support them and to de-escalate a situation, it's going to be harder to do that if someone is already kind of at the peak of overwhelm versus if they're just starting to feel more stress. So we can sometimes look for signs that a child is becoming a lot more quiet than typical, if that's uncharacteristic for them. Um, and it could just mean that they're tired and need a break. It doesn't necessarily mean that an intervention has to happen, but that can sometimes be a sign that they're hungry or thirsty or something else in the environment maybe needs a check-in. Sometimes if a child is pacing more or stimming more, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're having stress building, but that can sometimes be a little bit more of a common indication of that as well. Um, and as well as just if a child is showing visible signs of becoming more frustrated with routine or frequently asking to um, to leave or to switch activities a lot and seeming to not have as much in anything really holding their interest. Um, so some of the first things to check in on would be potentially temperature, food, and water. A lot of children, especially autistic children, may struggle to identify when they're hungry or thirsty or cold or tired. And so having someone provide those checks for them can be really beneficial. The general idea is to try and set a child up for success by putting them in an environment um, where they won't necessarily need to be redirected as often. Um, if a child is with, 10 peers and is constantly being directed away from their peers or directed to give more personal space, if that's a concept that they're still working on learning and may not understand at this point in time, that can be a lot of, in some cases, that can accumulate to be a lot of negative reminders or um, just a really stressful environment for the child where their full experience is one of constant redirection. So moving them sometimes with older children will work better, who may be more understanding, or with adults. And also finding alternative ways to release pent up energy. So if a child's becoming restless, um, maybe helping them maybe doing jumping jacks with them, singing a song with them, dancing with them, whatever activity will help get that energy out. Um, I wanted to just briefly show this quote on what meltdowns feel like, because I think it does also convey that these are really involuntary responses. Meltdowns can often include things like crying, screaming, throwing things. As it might sometimes be unsettling for people who are directly affected by the meltdown. It's also, I think, likely even more distressing for the person experiencing the meltdown. Um, so some strategies are again to move other people when possible, to remove any objects that could pose a safety concern. It's also really important, given how overwhelming the meltdown is for the person having it, to just give the person space unless they clearly seem to want you close by. Once they're in a safe environment, physically where all the safety concerns are removed, then space is really key. And if you are going to communicate, to use short phrases or sentences with a neutral body language. It's not the time to tell them to, it's not the time to scold them or to try and get them to change their behavior. Or, for example, if they threw something during a meltdown, it's not the time to try and get them to apologize or to understanding that throwing objects isn't safe, because they're going to be way too overwhelmed to um, to process that during a meltdown. And also, it very likely is that some of these behaviors are coming as an involuntary response. Um, so if we do think about potential strategies for a child who's throwing objects, we could provide a throwing basket. Um, that way they can still throw things, but it's going into a basket, so it's a little bit less volatile with potentially objects being thrown any which way. You could also provide safer throwing objects, so objects that are softer, just generally less hazardous. And this can be tricky because I don't think we want to overly restrict children. Just because someone has thrown an object once doesn't mean that they should be treated as a constant throwing hazard. But I think there is a balance between not wanting to preemptively be too cautious and at the same time setting kids up for success by avoiding areas that are likely um, to create a challenge for them. So if a child is just really enjoying throwing things throughout their entire time, maybe avoiding areas where throwing would be more of an issue. So for example, not taking them to a sandbox if other kids are there, because sandboxes can be really tricky for kids who like throwing things. If you're throwing sand and other kids are around, that can often end um, with the other kids becoming sad or upset, and then the child who is throwing the sand needing to be um, redirected in some way. And again, I think part of changing the environment could also mean putting the child with others who are going to be able to support the child more in the activity. So maybe other kids who enjoy throwing or who would want to play catch with the child, or just generally people who are less bothered uh by movement and relatively safe throwing going on around them. Another example is grabbing toys. So what if two children want the same toy? Maybe one child has the toy and another child takes it. pretty common scenario in childcare. One potential strategy is to offer a different toy to the child who took it. So if a child grabs their friend's toy car, you can offer the child a different toy and then take back the toy car and give it back to the initial child who had it. So this way, we're still showing that it's best to keep the toys with the person currently using them, but in a way that doesn't necessarily involve a lot of lecturing and that usually happens pretty smoothly, where both children hopefully at the end have a toy that they're happy with and the initial child has their toy back. Um, I also just want to continue to emphasize that there is often a lot behind these challenging behaviors. It can be anxiety, uncertainty, communication not being understood. I think for many of us, if we were in pain or tired, and on top of that, our communication of it isn't understood, or we're constantly being put in some situations that are confusing for us, that would be really stressful. Um, it can also be difficult for children who may have emotions or physical sensations like hunger that are difficult for them to identify. A child might be extremely hungry without really fully realizing that, and that can definitely impact their behavior as well. And part of this could also include physical pain, tiredness, etc. One last point that I wanted to emphasize, because unfortunately this is the case for many neurodivergent children, is experiencing unfair treatment. Oftentimes neurodivergent children are expected in interactions to be very accommodating of peers. I think an unfortunate example for many, especially middle school children or high school children, is that of being bullied frequently in school, and often not really having that be fully addressed um, by others or by teachers. And then sometimes if the child who is being bullied becomes visibly frustrated or cries or has a obvious reaction to it, then that reaction is treated as a problem. Um, and more generally, there can often be this experience where neurodivergent children are expected to do a lot of things that may not be very comfortable for them, like sit through unpleasant sensory stimuli, uh, sit still in a circle during circle time, to play back and forth with their peers in a way that's not necessarily natural for them. Um, and so I think one key to preventing meltdowns is to realize all the areas that neurodivergent children may be making accommodations for others that may go unnoticed or unrecognized. Because sometimes I think there can be a lot of awareness of accommodations that are given to neurodivergent children, but not as much awareness of accommodations that neurodivergent children are providing, which often are extensive to others. Finally, I wanted to briefly discuss pervasive demand for autonomy, which is sometimes also called pathological demand avoidance. And as a caveat, I'm not an expert on this profile of autism at all. It's not something that I personally experience, but the root of it is an anxiety-driven need for autonomy. I saw that quote in this article cited here and thought it was a really great summary of it. So some characteristics of this could be a strong response to a typical request. So a child may seem to really dislike being asked to do things, or may seem to experience a lot of stress with requests. So if you ask them, to hand you something or to change something about the way that they're playing, it could be particularly distressing for them. The child may also prefer to direct events or to be in a situation where they are able to know what to expect or where they're able to determine what to expect or what's going to happen. And they may also use negotiating or escape to avoid requests or to avoid situations that feel really anxiety inducing for them. And I think that this often, and I do think that this desire for autonomy is very understandable given that many neurodivergent children are frequently put in situations that are stressful. And so may become really hesitant to just trust that following the sort of schedule set out for them is going to keep them safe and comfortable. But I guess beyond the general concept of PDA, Some potentially helpful strategies could be providing options when possible, creating a game out of difficult tasks, and also using tones and phrasing that are as neutral and collaborative as possible. And also providing reasoning as part of that. So instead of just saying you can't do that, you can't look at that exhibit and expecting a child to just not do it because you said so, um, to provide a reason behind it. In this case, maybe the museum is going to close soon. And um, so unfortunately, just communicating that it's just not possible to look at the exhibit. This can come across as a little bit less directive than just telling them that they can't do something. So as a case study, we could really use all of these or any combination of these for an example where a child's maybe walking towards a pond or maybe where that could potentially be a safety hazard if the child shouldn't actually be going into the pond and the water inside of it. Um, for example, you can provide them with the option. You can say, okay, that pond unfortunately is not something that you can swim in right now. It's really cold. It's not going to be safe for you. But do you want to turn around, now, or do you want to get to go 10 more steps and then turn around? That way they have some control over the situation. Um, or you could create a game out of it so you can see how fast they can turn around or what is the silliest face they can do when they turn around. Or something like that. To be honest, I'm not the best at coming up with games on the spot. I think I'm a little bit better at some of these techniques in theory than I am in practice. That's really the gist of this crash course. Hopefully, some of the content in this was helpful for providing neurodiversity affirming childcare.